Hey, what is up, everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
There is a name that echoes across 10,000 years of war, a name whispered in cathedrals and cursed on battlefields, a name that carries with it the weight of a galaxy broken in half, of brothers turned against brothers, of a golden age shattered like glass beneath an armored boot. That name is Horus. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the favored son, the arch-traitor. And if you sit with me for a while, if you let the stars grow quiet around us and the hum of distant engines fade into nothing, I will tell you his story from beginning to end. Because no single figure in all the sprawling, blood-soaked history of the 41st millennium matters more than this one. Not the emperor himself, sitting silent and decaying upon his golden throne. Not any of the loyalist Primarchs who fought to preserve what their father built. Or not even the dark gods of chaos who lurk behind the veil of reality, feeding on the suffering of mortal souls. None of them would exist in their current forms without Horus. He is the fulcrum upon which 10,000 years of darkness balanced. He is the hinge upon which the door of history swung shut on humanity's brightest dream. To understand Warhammer 40,000, you must first understand Horus. Everything about the setting as we know it, the crumbling theocratic nightmare of the Imperium, the emperor entombed and worshipped as a god he never wanted to be, the shattered legions and the fractured chapters, the endless wars fought across 1,000,000 worlds beneath dying stars. All of it traces back to one Primarch's choices. One son's rebellion, one father's heartbreak. Strip away the power armor and the warp storms and the alien horrors lurking in the void. And at the very core of this universe, you find something deeply, achingly human. You find the story of a father and a son, of trust given and trust betrayed, of love that could not survive the weight of secrets and ambition and pride. That is what makes Horus the most important Primarch, not because he was the strongest, though he was formidable beyond measure, not because he was the most tactically brilliant, though his genius for war was staggering, but because his fall changed everything. His rebellion did not simply wound the Imperium, it fundamentally transformed it into something unrecognizable from what the Emperor had envisioned. Before Horus, humanity had a chance at a golden age. After Horus, there was only the grim darkness of an eternal present, where hope is a commodity more rare than any alien artifact, and where the laughter of thirsting gods echoes in the spaces between stars. So let us go back. Let us go all the way back, past the 40th millennium and its endless wars, past the great scouring and the shattered legions, past the siege and the betrayal and the drop pods screaming through burning skies. Let us go back to the very beginning, to a time before there were Primarchs at all, to a time when there was only the Emperor, alone with his dreams of a species united and the unimaginable work that lay ahead of him. And let us start with the creation of the being who would one day bring those dreams crashing down, on the Emperor's grand design and the birth of the Primarchs. Long before the Imperium stretched its fingers across the stars, before the Great Crusade lit the darkness of the galaxy with the fires of human ambition, the Emperor of mankind sat alone in his laboratories beneath the Himalayan mountains of ancient terror. The age of strife had ravaged humanity for thousands of years. Warp storms had cut off world from world, colony from colony, until the species that had once commanded the stars was reduced to scattered, frightened remnants, clinging to whatever ground they could hold. The Emperor, that immortal being of impossible age and unfathomable psychic power, looked upon the wreckage of human civilization and decided that he would fix it, not gradually, not patiently, but through the single most ambitious genetic engineering project in the history of any species that has ever drawn breath. He would create the Primarchs, 20 sons, forged from his own genetic material, shaped by science, so advanced it bordered on sorcery, and imbued with something more, something that required knowledge the Emperor had sought from beyond the boundaries of normal reality itself. The lore tells us, though the details remain shrouded in mystery and contradiction, that the Emperor traveled to the world of Molech during the Dark Age of technology. There, he found an ancient gateway into the warp, a portal into the realm of chaos itself. What he did beyond that gateway is debated endlessly. Some accounts suggest he bargained with the chaos gods and trading promises he never intended to keep in exchange for the knowledge of how to bind raw warp energy into living flesh. Others insist he simply took what he needed through the force of his own incomparable will. Whatever the truth, the Emperor returned from Molech changed. He came back with the knowledge to create beings that were more than human, more than genetically enhanced super soldiers. He could now craft demigods, beings with a spark of the warp woven into their very souls. 20 unique templates, each designed to embody a different aspect of human potential taken to its absolute extreme. And among those 20 templates, one was special. One was designed to be first among equals, the leader, the commander, the one who would stand at the Emperor's right hand and lead humanity's armies to victory across the galaxy. And that template would become Horus. But the Chaos Gods, those vast and terrible intelligences that dwell in the Imperium, had plans of their own. They had watched the Emperor enter their realm and leave again with stolen fire, like some ancient myth of a titan defying the gods. And they were not content to let his grand project succeed unchallenged. Before the Primarchs could be born, before they could draw their first breaths in the gene laboratories beneath the mountains, the ruinous powers reached through the warp and scattered them. 20 infant demigods, still gestating in their capsules, were torn from Terra and flung across the galaxy like seeds cast into a hurricane. Some landed on civilized worlds and were raised by noble families or wise mentors. Others fell onto planets of unimaginable brutality and had to claw their way to dominance through violence and sheer genetic superiority. One of them, the one who matters most to our story, landed on a world called Chthoniya. The wolves of Chthoniya. Chthoniya was not a kind world. It was barely a world at all, in truth. It was a mining planet, hollowed out over millennia by the extraction of minerals and resources until its surface was little more than a shell covering a labyrinth of tunnels, abandoned mine shafts, and sprawling underground warrens. What civilization existed on Chthoniya had long since collapsed into gang warfare. The surface was barren and lifeless. Below it, in the cramped and lightless tunnels, gangs of humans fought and killed and died over territory that was barely worth holding. It was a place where strength was the only currency, and mercy was a weakness that got you killed. This was where Horus landed. This was where the Emperor's favored son spent his formative years, though the details of that upbringing are frustratingly sparse compared to the rich histories we have for some of his brothers. What we do know is fragmentary and contradictory. The infant Primarch's capsule was found by a Chthonian gang overlord named Kagedon, who gave the child the name Nergui, a word that roughly translates to no name in the harsh dialect of the Chthonian underworld. It was a name that carried no honor, no lineage, no claim to anything. It was the name you gave to something disposable. But Horus was anything but disposable. Even as a child, his Primarch physiology set him apart. He grew faster than any normal human, his strength increasing at a rate that would have been terrifying to anyone who did not already live in a world where violence was as common as breathing. He learned the ways of the gangs, the brutal politics of the tunnels, the art of killing with crude weapons in cramped corridors where the darkness pressed in from all sides. He spoke the harsh language of Chthoniya, the rough dialect called Chthonic, with the particular hard-edged accent of the Western Hemispheric gangers, the lowest and most dangerous of the planet's feral castes. But here is the thing about Horus that separated him from nearly every other Primarch. While many of his brothers were shaped by their homeworlds in obvious and sometimes destructive ways, Angron broken by the butcher's nails, Conrad Kersey twisted by the nightmare of Nostromo, Horus seemed to absorb Chthoniya without being consumed by it. He took the toughness, the pragmatism, the street-level cunning of the gang warrens. But he did not become merely another gang lord. There was something more to him. A brightness. A charisma that could not be explained by genetics alone. People did not simply fear Horus. They wanted to follow him. They wanted to believe in whatever vision he was selling, even if that vision was nothing more complicated than surviving until tomorrow in a tunnel network that smelled of recycled air and old blood. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the Primarch who would one day betray everything. Horus was, above all else, magnetic. He drew people to him the way a fire draws moths. Not through intimidation, though he could certainly intimidate when he chose to, but through something subtler, something warmer. He made you feel like you mattered, like your concerns were his concerns, like your victories were his victories. This was a gift that would serve him brilliantly in the decades to come, when he stood at the head of armies, numbering in the hundreds of thousands, and needed every single soldier to believe that their commander loved them personally. It was also the gift that made his betrayal so devastating. Because when Horus turned, it was not like being stabbed by a stranger. It was like being stabbed by the person you loved most in all the world. The person who had looked into your eyes and made you feel seen. The person who had called you brother and meant it, or so you thought. That is the cruelty of charisma. When it is withdrawn, when it is revealed to have been a lie or a weapon, the wound it leaves behind is worse than any blade could inflict. Chthonius sat close to Terra, only a few light years distant in a galaxy where most of the Primarchs were scattered across impossible distances. This proximity meant that Horus was the first Primarch to be found by the Emperor, or at least, the first by traditional accounts. Some sources suggest that Alpharius may have been discovered earlier, but the commonly accepted history holds that it was Horus who first looked upon his father's face and recognized something of himself in those ancient golden eyes. The meeting between the Emperor and Horus is one of those moments in the lore that feels almost mythic in its simplicity. Here was the most powerful being in human history, a creature of unfathomable age and ability, coming face to face with the first of his gene-forged sons. And what did he find? Not a philosopher king like Guilliman, not a tortured artist like Fulgrim, not a brooding avenger like Corax. He found a gang fighter from the worst tunnels of a dying mining world, a young man with calloused hands and sharp eyes, and a smile that could disarm a room full of killers. And the Emperor saw in that smile exactly what he had designed Horus to be: a leader, a unifier, a son who could stand beside him and help him rebuild everything that had been lost. For 30 years, the Emperor and Horus were inseparable. 30 years of war, of conquest, of forging the early Imperium from the raw materials of a galaxy that had spent millennia tearing itself apart. In those 3 decades, Horus learned at the feet of a being who had lived for tens of thousands of years. He absorbed the Emperor's wisdom about strategy, about governance, about the delicate art of bringing conquered peoples into the fold of a new civilization without crushing their spirits entirely. He watched his father fight and lead and judge, and he modeled himself on what he saw. And the Emperor watched his son and felt something that, for a being of his nature, was extraordinarily rare. He felt pride, genuine, uncomplicated pride in what Horus was becoming. Not a weapon, though Horus was devastating on the battlefield. Not a tool, though Horus was useful beyond measure, but a son. A partner in the great work of rebuilding humanity's shattered dream. This bond between them was the foundation upon which the entire Great Crusade was built. And it was the foundation that, when it cracked, brought everything crashing down. Side by side, across the stars. The Great Crusade was the most ambitious military campaign in the history of any species. Its goal was nothing less than the reunification of all human worlds across the entire Milky Way galaxy, thousands upon thousands of planets that had been isolated during the Age of Strife, many of which had developed their own cultures, governments, religions, and in some cases, dangerous alliances with alien species. The Emperor intended to bring them all under a single banner, the Imperium of Man, and in doing so, create a civilization powerful enough to resist the predations of chaos and the countless Xenos threats that lurked in the darkness between stars. To accomplish this, he needed his Primarchs and their legions, or 20 legions of Space Marines, each one a force of genetically engineered super soldiers, numbering in the tens or even hundreds of thousands, led by the demigod sons of the Emperor himself. It was a military machine of staggering proportions, and at its very tip, leading the spearhead that pushed into the unknown, was Horus and the 16th Legion. They were called the Lunar Wolves in those early days, a name earned during the first pacification of Luna in the earliest years of the Crusade, when the Legion had proved itself in ferocious combat against the techno-barbarian clans that held Terra's moon. The name stuck, and it suited them. There was something wolfish about the 16th Legion. They were aggressive, fast, and utterly ruthless in the attack. They favored sudden and overwhelming strikes that decapitated enemy leadership before the bulk of the opposition even knew the fight had begun. They were shock troops of the highest caliber, and under Horus's command, they became something even more than that. They became a precision instrument of conquest. But Horus's genius lay not in brute force alone. Many of his brother Primarchs could match or even exceed him in raw martial ability. Angron was a more ferocious fighter. Leman Russ was a more savage hunter. Perturabo was a more methodical siege master. What made Horus exceptional was his versatility. He could be diplomatic when diplomacy was called for, bringing worlds into compliance through negotiation and charm rather than bloodshed. He could be brutal when brutality was required, a crushing resistance so thoroughly that the survivors had no choice but to submit. And he could switch between these modes effortlessly, reading the situation with an intuition that seemed almost supernatural. The Emperor recognized this quality and exploited it fully. During those first 30 years of the Crusade, when Horus was the only Primarch who had been found, the Emperor and his son fought side by side across dozens of worlds. The battles they shared became the stuff of legend, stories that would be told and retold for millennia by the warriors who inherited their legacy. At the Siege of Rylus, Horus was struck down by a plasma blast that knocked him unconscious and sent him sprawling to the ground. The Emperor stood over his fallen son like a guardian from ancient myth, killing everything that came near until reinforcements arrived to secure the area. It was an act of paternal protectiveness that spoke volumes about the bond between them. The Emperor of mankind, the most powerful being in the galaxy, standing like a shield over his wounded child. Not because Horus was strategically important, though he was, but because the Emperor loved him. Horus repaid that debt later, on the Orc world of Goro. The Emperor found himself locked in hand-to-hand combat with a massive Orc warlord, the alien's brutal strength threatening to choke the life from the master of mankind. Horus did not hesitate. He threw himself into the fray and struck the Orc's arm from its body with a single blow, freeing his father from the creature's grip. Father saved son, son saved father. The cycle of trust and devotion continued, each act of sacrifice reinforcing the bond between them. These stories were not just military history, they were the mythology of the early Imperium. They were the tales that Space Marines whispered to each other in the quiet moments between battles, the legends that gave meaning and shape to the Great Crusade itself. Horus and the Emperor, fighting together across the stars. It was the foundation narrative of a civilization being born, and it carried with it an implicit promise. As long as the Emperor and his favored son stood together, nothing in the galaxy could stop humanity's ascent. But promises, even implicit ones, are fragile things, and the galaxy has a way of breaking everything that is fragile, no matter how beautiful it might be. The Brotherhood of the Mournival. To understand Horus as a leader, you need to understand the structures he built around himself. Unlike some of his brother Primarchs, who ruled their legions through fear or religious devotion or cold bureaucratic efficiency, Horus led through personal connection. He wanted to be close to his warriors. He wanted to know them, to understand their concerns, to hear their opinions, even when those opinions contradicted his own. This was not mere affectation. This was how Horus processed the world. He thought best when he was surrounded by people he trusted, people who would tell him the truth even when the truth was uncomfortable. The purest expression of this leadership philosophy was the Mournival, an informal advisory council composed of 4 captains chosen from among the legion's finest. The Mournival had no official standing in the imperial chain of command. Yes, it carried no rank, no formal authority, no recognition from anyone outside the 16th Legion itself. It was purely internal, purely personal, a creation of Horus himself that reflected his belief that the best decisions came from the collision of different perspectives. The 4 members of the Mournival were chosen not for their similarity, but for their differences. Each was meant to embody a different temperament, a different way of seeing the world, so that together they could provide Horus with a complete picture of any situation. The old Terran concept of the 4 humors applied here, the idea that the ideal council comes from balancing opposing natures against each other. At the end of the Great Crusade, the Mournival consisted of 4 warriors whose names would become synonymous with the tragedy of the Horus heresy itself. Or Ezekiel Abaddon, first captain of the Lunar Wolves, was the choleric, the man of action and fury. He was a towering figure even by Space Marine standards, a Chthonian-born killer whose massive build and natural ferocity made him a legend on the battlefield. Abaddon was the son who most resembled his father, not in appearance necessarily, but in temperament. He was aggressive, dominant, utterly devoted to Horus, and completely unwilling to accept any outcome that was not total victory. When the War Master needed someone to kick down a door and kill everything on the other side, Abaddon was the hand he reached for. Horus Aximand, the 5th captain, was the melancholic. They called him Little Horus because of all the Lunar Wolves. He bore the closest physical resemblance to the Primarch himself. All sons of Horus tended to look somewhat like their gene father, but Aximand's resemblance was striking enough to earn him the nickname. He was thoughtful, contemplative, prone to brooding in ways that his more boisterous brothers found puzzling. But his strategic mind was sharp, and his loyalty to Horus ran so deep that it would ultimately lead him down a path he might never have chosen for himself. Tarik Torgadon, captain of the 2nd Company, was the sanguine. He was the joker of the group, the one who lightened the mood when things grew too dark, the one who played practical jokes on his battle brothers and laughed at death with an irreverence that was unusual and refreshing among the usually grim Astartes. Torgadon's humor was not mere frivolity. It was a tool, a way of cutting through tension and pretension, Mace of reminding everyone around him that they were still human beings despite the genetic engineering and the centuries of war. He was beloved within the Legion, and his friendship with Garviel Loken would become one of the most poignant relationships in the entire heresy narrative. And then there was Garviel Loken himself, captain of the 10th Company, the phlegmatic. Loken was the newcomer, elevated to the Mournival after the death of the previous member, the beloved Hastor Sejanus. Where the others were passionate or moody or irreverent, Loken was steady, principled, calm under pressure, unshakable in his commitment to what he believed was right. He was the moral compass of the group, the one who asked the uncomfortable questions about whether what they were doing was truly just, whether the means they employed were worthy of the ends they sought. Together, these 4 men formed the beating heart of the Lunar Wolves. They were Horus's closest companions, his trusted advisors, his brothers in every way that mattered. They argued with each other, challenged each other, watched each other's backs in the hell of combat. And in the end, when the corruption came, the Mournival was split down the middle. Abaddon and Aximand followed Horus into damnation. Torgadon and Loken stood loyal to the Emperor. The breaking of the Mournival was the breaking of the Lunar Wolves themselves, a microcosm of the larger catastrophe that was about to engulf the entire galaxy. But that breaking was still in the future. For now, in the bright days of the Great Crusade's zenith, what the Mournival rode alongside their Primarch into battle after battle, and the galaxy trembled before them, the crown of thorns, Ullanor, and the title of Warmaster, 200 years. That is how long the Great Crusade burned its way across the galaxy, before it reached what many considered its single greatest moment. 2 centuries of unrelenting warfare, of worlds brought to compliance one after another, of the Emperor's armies pushing the borders of the Imperium outward in every direction, like a tide of ceramite and bolter fire. And at the head of that tide, more often than not, was Horus and his lunar wolves. They had earned more battle honors than almost any other legion. Their record of successful campaigns was staggering, and the brightness of their victories was matched by few. When people across the nascent Imperium thought of the Space Marine legions, they thought first of the lunar wolves and their golden-tongued Primarch. Horus had become the face of the Great Crusade, the embodiment of everything the Emperor had promised humanity could achieve. And then came Ullanor. The Ullanor Crusade was the largest single military operation of the Great Crusade, a massive imperial assault on the most powerful Orc empire ever encountered. The overlord Urlak Uruk had built a green-skinned stellar empire of terrifying scope, ruling from a central world in the Ullanor system that bristled with the crude but devastating military infrastructure that only the Orcs could create. The Emperor determined that this empire must be broken, not merely defeated but annihilated so thoroughly that no Orc warlord could ever rebuild it. The forces deployed were staggering. 100,000 space marines drawn from multiple legions, 8 million Imperial army soldiers, thousands of warships and their support fleets. It was a gathering of military power that the galaxy had never seen before and would rarely see again. And at the tip of the spear, as always, was Horus. The campaign itself was a masterclass in combined arms warfare. Multiple legions struck at the Orc Empire's outlying territories simultaneously, drawing their forces away from the central stronghold, like a surgeon exposing a vital organ before making the killing cut. And when the moment came, when the Orcs' attention was divided across a dozen fronts, Horus struck at the heart. He led his first company Terminators in a direct teleportation assault on the Orc Overlord's palace, and it was a move of breathtaking audacity. The kind of operation that only works when the commander has absolute faith in his warriors and they have absolute faith in him. Horus personally led 10 of his finest Terminators into combat against the Orc warlord and his bodyguard of 40 of the largest and most brutal greenskins the Imperium had ever encountered. The fighting was savage beyond description. Ceramite cracked under the impact of crude but devastatingly powerful Orc weapons. The corridors of the alien palace ran with blood, both human and Xenos. When the dust settled, the Orc overlord lay dead, his broken body cast from the battlements of his own tower by Horus's own hands. And every single Terminator who had accompanied the Primarch into that final chamber was dead. Every Terminator except one. Ezekiel Abaddon, her first captain of the Lunar Wolves, was found barely alive beneath a mountain of Orc corpses. The future despoiler had fought with a fury that would have seemed impossible for any warrior who was not born on the gang-riddled tunnels of Chthoniya. He alone had survived, and his survival sealed the bond between him and his Primarch in a way that nothing else could have. Abaddon was Horus's man, body and soul. He had proven it in the only currency that mattered: blood. The Ullanor Crusade was a triumph in every sense of the word. The Orc Empire was shattered, its warlord dead, its armies broken and scattered. And in the aftermath, the Emperor of mankind did something extraordinary. He held a triumph, a celebration of victory on a scale that the Imperium had never seen. Multiple Primarchs gathered together, a rare assembly of the Emperor's sons. And in front of them all, in front of the massed legions and the cheering armies and the watching galaxy, the Emperor bestowed upon Horus a title that had never existed before and would never be given to another. Warmaster, Commander-in-Chief of all the Emperor's armies. supreme authority over every military force in the Imperium, the right to command his brother Primarchs and their legions as he saw fit. It was the greatest honor that the Emperor could bestow, and he gave it to Horus because, in his judgment, no one else deserved it. No one else could have carried the weight of it. Horus was initially reluctant. He understood, perhaps better than anyone, the jealousies that such a title would provoke among his brothers. Some of them, Guilliman with his administrative genius, the Lion with his martial brilliance, Sanguinius with his grace and nobility, any of them might have argued that they deserved the honor just as much. And some of them, though they would never say it publicly, resented being placed beneath a brother they considered an equal. But the Emperor's word was final. Horus was War Master. The decision was made. What happened next, however, is what planted the first real seeds of catastrophe. Having bestowed this unprecedented title upon his favored son, the Emperor announced that he was returning to Terra. He was leaving the Great Crusade. He had a project of enormous importance that required his personal attention, a project he refused to discuss with any of his sons, not even Horus. Think about that for a moment. Imagine being told by your father, the man you have spent your entire life trying to please, or the being you admire above all others, that he trusts you enough to put you in charge of everything. And then imagine him walking away without telling you why, without explaining where he is going or what he is doing or when, if ever, he plans to come back. Imagine the combination of pride and abandonment that would create. The honor of the title mixed with the sting of the dismissal. The implicit message that you are good enough to run things in his absence, but not important enough to know his secrets. This is what the Emperor did to Horus. And while the Emperor almost certainly had his reasons that may have been related to the massive webway project he was constructing beneath the Imperial Palace, a project that could have freed humanity from dependence on the chaos-tainted warp for interstellar travel, the damage was done. A crack appeared in the foundation of the relationship between father and son. A crack that would widen with every passing year until it became wide enough for the Chaos Gods to reach through and pull Horus down into the darkness. But the Emperor did more than simply leave. He also established the Council of Terra, a governing body composed of mortal civilians, ordinary humans without the genetic enhancements of the Astartes, to manage the day-to-day administration of the growing Imperium. To Horus and many of his brothers, this was a slap in the face. They had spent 2 centuries conquering the galaxy, bleeding and dying on world after world, and now the Emperor was handing the governance of their conquests to mortals, to people who had never held a bolter or watched a brother fall in battle. Why, it felt like a betrayal of the implicit compact between the Emperor and his sons. We fight, we bleed, we conquer, and in return, we rule. Horus tried to suppress his resentment.
Honestly, this is the part of the lore that hits me the hardest every single time I come back to it. Because you can sit here and read all the wiki pages and all the novels and all the codex entries, and none of it really captures what makes Horus work as a character until you stop and think about him as a person. Not a Primarch, not a demigod, just a son who felt like his dad walked out on him without saying why. I think that is why so many of us in this community keep coming back to the heresy over and over again. It is not really about the massive battles, even though those are incredible. It is about the fact that underneath all the ceremony and the gene forging, this is just a story about family falling apart. And I do not know about you, but that resonates with me way more than any Chaos Demon or Titan battle ever could. Horus did not need the Chaos Gods to feel abandoned. That feeling was already there. They just gave him somewhere to put it. But anyways, that's just my 2 cents. Let's get back to the video.
He threw himself into his duties as War Master with the same energy and brilliance that had defined his entire career. But the feelings were there, buried deep, festering in the quiet moments between campaigns. A nagging sense of inadequacy, a whisper of doubt about whether the Emperor truly valued his sons, or simply viewed them as tools to be used and discarded when their purpose was fulfilled. It was at this time that the Lunar Wolves were renamed. Following the Ullanor triumph, the Emperor himself suggested that the 16th Legion should bear its Primarch's name, becoming the Sons of Horus. Horus was reluctant at first, uncomfortable with the level of self-aggrandizement this represented. It was a conversation with his brother Sanguinius, the angelic Primarch of the Blood Angels, and perhaps Horus's closest friend among the other Primarchs, that finally convinced him to accept the change. Sanguinius argued that Horus needed to establish his authority more firmly over the other Primarchs, that the name change was not vanity, but necessity. The lunar wolves became the Sons of Horus, and their armor shifted from the pale grey and white of the wolves to the distinctive sea green of their reborn identity. Looking back, there is something bitterly ironic about this transformation. The legion that bore its Primarch's name with such pride would, 10,000 years later, erase that name entirely. They would paint their armor black and call themselves the Black Legion, and the name Horus would become a curse upon their lips rather than a battle cry. But that darkness was still far ahead. For now, the Sons of Horus stood at the pinnacle of the Imperium's military hierarchy, and their father stood at the pinnacle of the galaxy's power structure. Everything seemed golden, everything seemed perfect. And that is precisely when things began to fall apart. The web of Erebus, seeds of corruption. There is a character in this story who deserves a special kind of infamy, not Horus himself, for Horus was at least tragic in his fall. A great soul brought low by forces that exploited his very real flaws. No, the special infamy belongs to a being who was nothing more or less than a dedicated servant of evil, and a manipulator of breathtaking cunning who orchestrated the downfall of humanity's golden age with patience and precision that bordered on the inhuman. His name was Erebus, first chaplain of the Word-Bearers Legion, the Hand of Destiny, as he called himself, the father of the Horus heresy. To understand how Horus fell, you need to understand the web that Erebus wove around him. It was not a sudden thing. There was no single moment when Horus woke up and decided to betray everything he had ever believed in. The corruption was gradual, subtle, and meticulously planned. It was the work of decades, of carefully planted seeds watered by patience and cruelty in equal measure. The story begins with the word-bearers themselves. Once the most devout of the Emperor's legions, they had worshipped the Emperor as a divine being, spreading his cult across the worlds they conquered. But the Emperor was not a god and did not wish to be worshipped as one. In a moment of devastating public humiliation, he forced the entire Word-Bearers Legion to kneel before him and reprimanded their Primarch, Lorgar, for spreading religious devotion rather than the secular imperial truth. The psychic wound this inflicted on Lorgar was profound. Desperate for something to believe in, the Primarch and his legion eventually found their way to the Eye of Terror, the massive warp rift that scars the galaxy's northeastern reaches. There, they found the Chaos Gods. There, they pledged themselves to powers that were happy to be worshipped. And there, they began to plan the destruction of the Emperor who had rejected their devotion. Erebus was the instrument of this plan. Working in secret, he and his fellow word-bearers established warrior lodges within the other Space Marine legions. These lodges were modeled on the tribal societies of a world called Davin, a feral planet that the lunar wolves and word-bearers had brought to compliance during the Great Crusade. On the surface, the lodges seemed harmless. They were fraternal organizations, places where Space Marines could gather outside the formal hierarchy of their legions, where rank was set aside and brothers could speak freely. But beneath this benign facade, the lodges were weapons. They were tools for identifying which Space Marines might be sympathetic to rebellion and which would need to be eliminated before any coup could succeed. The lodge within the Lunar Wolves, called the Quiet Order, grew slowly but steadily, and its members came to value the informality and brotherhood it offered, the sense of being part of something secret and special. Horus himself was aware of the lodge and permitted its existence, seeing it as a harmless indulgence that helped maintain morale within his legion. He could not know that it was a Trojan horse, designed to infiltrate and corrupt his warriors from within. But the lodges were only the groundwork. The real trap was far more personal, and it was sprung on the moon of Davin. The circumstances were carefully orchestrated by Erebus, though the full extent of his manipulation would not be understood until long after the damage was done. The sons of Horus were called back to Davin, a world they had conquered 60 years earlier, because Erebus reported that the planetary governor they had left behind, a man named Eugen Temba, had turned traitor. Horus, never one to delegate when his personal honor was at stake, led an assault force to Davin's moon to deal with the situation himself. What he found on that moon was not a simple rebellion. Temba had been corrupted by Nurgle, the chaos god of disease and decay. He had become a bloated, mutated horror, barely recognizable as the man Horus had once appointed to govern Davin. And in his hand, Temba wielded a weapon of terrible significance. It was called the Kinnabrach Anatheme, an ancient Xenos blade that had been sacred to Nurgle. This weapon had been stolen by Erebus from the museum of an advanced human civilization called the Interrex during a diplomatic mission that Erebus himself had deliberately sabotaged. Erebus had given the blade to Temba, and knowing exactly what would happen when the corrupted governor used it against the War Master. Horus killed Temba. He crushed the swollen, warp-twisted governor with the contemptuous ease of a Primarch dealing with something far beneath his power level. But in the process, Temba managed to wound Horus with the anatheme. The blade bit into the War Master's shoulder, and the venom it carried, a toxin suffused with the raw essence of chaos, began to spread through his superhuman body. The apothecaries of the sons of Horus tried everything. Every form of advanced medical technology at their disposal was brought to bear against the poison that was killing their Primarch. Nothing worked. The wound refused to heal. The toxin defied analysis. Horus lay dying, his consciousness fading, and his superhuman physiology overwhelmed by a force that no amount of genetic engineering could resist. And that is when Erebus made his move. Working through the warrior lodge, playing on the desperate love that the sons of Horus felt for their Primarch, Erebus convinced the Legion's leadership to take Horus to the Temple of the Serpent Lodge on Davin. He told them it was a house of healing. He told them the Davinite priests could save the War Master where Imperial medicine had failed. What he did not tell them was that the Serpent Lodge was a chaos cult, devoted to chaos undivided, and that the healing they offered would come at a price that made death look merciful by comparison. The temple itself was an imposing structure, an octagonal building set in the center of an enormous crater, approached by a causeway lined with crumbling statues of ancient Davinite kings. Inside, the rituals began. The priests of the Serpent Lodge performed their dark rites, and Horus's consciousness was drawn out of his dying body and into the warp itself. What happened to Horus in the Imperium is perhaps the most important single event in the history of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. It is the moment when the future of humanity was decided, not on a battlefield, but in the contested territory of one Primarch's soul. Within the warp, Horus encountered a being that wore the face of Hastur Sejanus, his beloved dead captain, the man whose loss he had never fully processed. This being, this illusion crafted by Erebus and powered by the Chaos Gods, showed Horus visions of the future. A future where the Emperor ruled as a god over a theocratic nightmare. A future where the Primarchs were discarded like used tools, just as the Thunder Warriors had been discarded before them. A future where everything Horus and his brothers had fought and bled for was twisted into something monstrous. The visions were lies, or at best, half-truths twisted beyond recognition. But they were crafted with diabolical precision to exploit exactly the fears and resentments that had been growing inside Horus ever since the Emperor's departure from the Great Crusade. The sense of abandonment, the feeling that mortal humans were being elevated above the Primarchs, the suspicion that the Emperor's secret project on Terra was something that would ultimately render the Space Marine legions obsolete. His brother Magnus the Red, but the psychically gifted Primarch of the Thousand Suns, attempted to reach Horus during his warp-induced coma. Magnus saw what was happening and tried to warn his brother, tried to pull him back from the edge, but Magnus arrived too late. Or perhaps the Chaos Gods ensured that his intervention would fail. The seeds had already taken root in soil that was all too fertile. Horus emerged from the Temple of the Serpent Lodge on the 9th day, as the Davonite traditions dictated. He appeared healed. His body was whole again, his wound closed, his strength restored. The sons of Horus rejoiced. Their father had returned to them. The War Master was alive. But the Horus who walked out of that temple was not the same man who had been carried in. Something fundamental had changed within him. The Chaos Gods had made their bargain. Well, they had shown Horus a path to power that did not require the Emperor's approval or blessing. They had whispered promises of glory that the secular Imperium could never match. And Horus, brilliant, charismatic, flawed Horus, had listened. He did not become a raving madman. That is an important distinction. The corruption of Horus was not the crude, obvious kind that turned men into gibbering monsters. It was subtle, insidious. Horus remained himself in many ways. He was still charming, still brilliant, still capable of inspiring absolute devotion in those around him. But now, there was something behind his eyes that had not been there before. A cold calculation. A willingness to do whatever was necessary to achieve his goals, no matter how many worlds burned or how many brothers died. The road from Davin to Terra would take years to walk, and every step of the way, the galaxy would bleed. The fires of Istvan. Brotherhood shattered. With the corruption firmly rooted in his soul, Horus began to move with the calculated precision that had always defined his military genius. But now that genius was turned inward, directed not at the enemies of humanity, but at the Imperium itself. The first and most immediate problem he faced was also the most painful. He needed to purge his own legion. Within the sons of Horus, as within all the traitor legions, there were space marines who would never willingly betray the Emperor. Warriors whose loyalty to their oaths transcended even their loyalty to their Primarch. These men had to be identified and eliminated before the rebellion could begin in earnest. The warrior lodges proved their worth here. Through the Quiet Order, and Horus and his co-conspirators were able to determine with chilling accuracy which members of the Sons of Horus would follow the War Master into damnation and which would resist. The loyal ones were marked for death, and the instrument of their destruction would be a world called Istvan III. The official story was simple enough. A Slaaneshi cult had corrupted the planetary government of Istvan III, and the Sons of Horus, along with elements of the Emperor's children, World Eaters, and Death Guard, were being deployed to bring the world back to compliance. It was exactly the kind of operation that these legions had performed hundreds of times before. Nothing about it should have raised suspicion, but there was a secret within the secret. The Space Marines being deployed to the surface were not chosen randomly, and they were chosen because they had been identified as loyalists. They were being sent down to die. Once the loyalist elements were on the surface, engaged with the enemy, Horus gave the order that announced the heresy to the galaxy. He commanded a virus bombardment of Istvan III, Life Eater virus, a weapon of such horrific potency that it killed every living thing it touched, reducing organic matter to a caustic sludge in moments. The virus bombs rained down on the planet, and the firestorm that followed when the released gases ignited consumed the entire world in flame. 8 billion civilians died in the bombardment. But the true target was the loyalist Space Marines on the surface. Horus intended to kill them all in a single stroke, eliminating the opposition within his own ranks before anyone could raise the alarm. He almost succeeded. Almost. But Space Marines are extraordinarily difficult to kill, even with weapons of planetary destruction. Some of the Loyalists, warned by the heroic actions of Emperor's children. Captain Saul Tarvitz, who had learned of the betrayal and raced to the surface to warn his brothers, managed to find shelter. They survived the bombardment, and what followed was a brutal, agonizing ground war in the blasted ruins of Istvan III's capital, the Choral city. It was here that the Mournival was torn apart. On one side stood Abaddon and Aximand, loyal to Horus above all else. On the other stood Torgadon and Loken, loyal to the Emperor and to the oaths they had sworn when they first took up the bolter in humanity's name. Brothers who had fought side by side for centuries now faced each other across the ash-covered ruins of a murdered world. The final confrontation came on the last day of the battle. Torgadon and Loken received word that Abaddon and Aximand had landed on the surface to oversee the final destruction of the Loyalist holdouts. In a desperate gambit, they attempted to ambush their former brothers at the landing site, hoping that if they could kill the traitors, they might slow Horus's plans enough for word to reach Terra. It was a doomed effort. Tarik Torgadon, the laughing warrior, the joker who had kept his brother's spirits high through centuries of war, met his end at the hands of Horus Aximand. Little Horus killed his friend with reluctance, with something approaching grief, but he killed him nonetheless. The sword called Mournital, Aximand's relic blade, lived up to its name that day, while the loss of Torgadon was the loss of laughter itself from the sons of Horus. The light went out, and only shadows remained. Loken survived, barely. He was beaten by Abaddon and buried beneath rubble when the final orbital bombardment struck. Against all odds, he lived, and his story would continue through the heresy as a knight-errant in the service of Malkador the Sigillite, the Emperor's right hand. But the Garviel Loken who crawled from the ruins of Istvan III was a different man from the calm, principled captain who had joined the Mournival in happier days. He carried the scars of betrayal with him, and they would never fully heal. But Istvan III was only the beginning. The Loyalist survivors aboard the frigate Eisenstein, led by the Death Guard captain Nathaniel Garrow, she managed to escape the system and carry word of Horus's treachery to Terra. The secret was out. The Imperium knew that the War Master had turned traitor. The response was swift. Rogel Dawn, the granite-hard Primarch of the Imperial Fists and Praetorian of Terra, was furious beyond measure. Under the Emperor's orders, he assembled a retribution fleet of 7 full Space Marine legions to bring Horus to justice. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard would form the vanguard. The Iron Warriors, Word-Bearers, Night Lords, and Alpha Legion would follow as the reserve. It was a force of breathtaking military power. 7 legions, hundreds of thousands of Space Marines, committed to the singular purpose of crushing a rebellion before it could spread. Under normal circumstances, such a force would have been more than sufficient to destroy even the War Master. But Horus had planned for this. He had anticipated the retribution fleet. He had counted on it, in fact, because 4 of the 7 legions in that fleet had already secretly pledged their loyalty to him. The Iron Warriors under Perturabo, the Word-Bearers under Lorgar, the Night Lords under Conrad Kurz, the Alpha Legion under Alpharius. These were not reinforcements coming to punish Horus. They were the jaws of a trap waiting to snap shut. The drop site massacre on Istvan V was the single deadliest act of treachery in the Horus heresy, and it broke 3 Loyalist legions in a single afternoon. The Loyalist vanguard, the Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard, made planetfall in the Urgol Depression, a volcanic valley that Horus had chosen as his killing ground. The position was heavily fortified, the defenses designed by Fulgrim and his Emperor's children with the assistance of Dark Mechanicum engineers. But the Loyalists attacked with the fury of men who had been betrayed by brothers they once trusted, and initially, they pushed the traitors back. Ferrus Manus, Primarch of the Iron Hands, was consumed by rage. His close friend Fulgrim had tried to recruit him to Horus's cause, and the betrayal had driven the Gorgon to a white-hot fury that obliterated his usual tactical caution. He threw himself at the traitor lines with everything he had, his Iron Hands Terminators smashing through fortifications and crushing opposition with mechanical precision. Then the reserves were called in, and the 4 secretly treacherous legions descended from orbit, and instead of attacking the traitors, they turned their guns on the Loyalists. The Iron Hands, Salamanders, and Raven Guard found themselves caught in a crossfire of unimaginable intensity. 8 traitor legions poured fire into 3 loyalist legions from every direction. The slaughter was almost beyond description. Ferrus Manus fell, killed by his former brother Fulgrim, who took his head as a trophy and presented it to Horus. Vulcan of the Salamanders and Corvus Corax of the Raven Guard barely survived, their legions shattered around them. More than 90% of the loyalist forces deployed to Istvan V were destroyed. The Salamanders would never again reach legion strength. The Raven Guard was reduced to a shadow of its former power. The Iron Hands were broken, as their Primarch dead, their purpose reduced to bitter vengeance. Horus stood among the carnage like a dark god surveying his handiwork. The trap had worked perfectly. In a single battle, he had effectively removed a third of his most dangerous opponents from the board. The road to terror was open, and Horus, with the blood of his brothers still wet upon the ground, looked toward the distant light of Sol and began to march. The long road to terror. Molech and the price of power. The march from Istvan to Terra was not a straight line. It could not be. Despite the devastating success of the drop site massacre, Horus faced a galaxy that was still largely loyal to the Emperor. Dozens of legions, billions of Imperial army soldiers, entire planetary systems and fleet elements stood between the War Master and his ultimate prize. But the war that followed was fought across thousands of worlds over a period of 7 years, a conflict so vast and so terrible that its full scope may never be entirely catalogued. But there is one campaign in particular that demands our attention, because it represents a turning point, not just in the military progress of the heresy, but in the fundamental nature of Horus himself. That campaign was the invasion of Molech. Molech was a night world, a planet of thick jungles and savage beasts, where noble houses commanded the great war machines known as Imperial Knights. But its surface geography was not what made Molech important. What made Molech important was what lay beneath it. Hidden beneath the planet's crust was the same ancient warp gate that the Emperor had used thousands of years earlier to gain the knowledge needed to create the Primarchs. The Emperor had visited Molech during the Great Crusade, bringing several of his Primarchs with him, including Horus. But afterward, he had erased the memory of the gateway from their minds, hiding its significance behind psychic barriers that should have been impenetrable. He left behind a substantial garrison and the night houses of Molech to guard the site, and he placed a fellow perpetual, the immortal woman Olivia Soreka, on the planet specifically to ensure that no one else would ever use the warp gate. But the corruption of chaos had unlocked memories that the Emperor had buried. Horus remembered Molech. He remembered the gateway, and he understood, with the terrible clarity that the Chaos Gods had granted him, that the power the Emperor had gained beyond that gate was the same power he needed to challenge his father directly. The invasion of Molech was massive. The sons of Horus and the Death Guard, led by Horus and Mortarion respectively, descended upon the planet with overwhelming force. The loyalist garrison fought bravely, the night houses committed their war machines to the defense, and the battles that raged across Molech's continents were among the bloodiest of the entire heresy. But Horus was not interested in the surface battles. He was interested in the gate. When Horus finally reached the warp gate and stepped through it, what happened on the other side changed him forever. He encountered the 4 great powers of chaos directly, those vast and terrible intelligences that dwell in the deepest strata of the warp, and he made a bargain with them. The exact nature of that bargain remains uncertain, shrouded in conflicting accounts and deliberate obfuscation. But the results were undeniable. Horus emerged from the warp gate transformed. His power had increased exponentially. He was no longer simply a Primarch with exceptional abilities. He was something closer to a demigod, a vessel for the combined might of all 4 chaos powers. But the price was equally staggering. From the moment Horus stepped through that gate, the clock began ticking on his existence. The power of the Chaos Gods was not a gift freely given. It was an investment, a down payment on the destruction they expected Horus to deliver, and that power came with a time limit. All the immense energies coursing through Horus's body were slowly consuming him from within. He had gained the strength to challenge the Emperor, but he had also ensured that he could not afford a long war. He needed to reach Terra quickly, before the power that sustained him burned him out entirely. This is one of the great ironies of Horus's story. The power that made him strong enough to threaten the Emperor was the same power that forced him into strategic decisions he might otherwise have avoided. Every month that passed brought him closer to a confrontation he was not certain he could win, while simultaneously weakening the weapon he had chosen to fight with. He was a man riding a tiger, unable to dismount without being devoured. Leman Russ and his space wolves attempted to stop Horus after Molech. The Wolf King tracked the vengeful spirit through the warp and managed to board it with a large force of space wolves. The confrontation between Russ and Horus was titanic, a clash between two of the Emperor's mightiest sons. Russ wielded the Spear of Russ, an artifact of extraordinary power, and he managed to wound Horus grievously, even temporarily cleansing some of the chaos corruption that had taken hold of the War Master. For one brief moment, Russ looked into his brother's eyes and saw Horus Lupercal, the real Horus, the man who had once been his friend and his comrade. He offered Horus a chance. Come back, return to Terra. Let the Emperor heal you. It is not too late. But it was too late. Even with the corruption momentarily stripped away, even with the real Horus looking out from behind the mask of chaos, the War Master refused. He had gone too far, done too much. The blood of brothers stained his hands, and no amount of healing could wash it away. Horus rejected Russ's offer and attacked with renewed ferocity. The Space Wolves were driven back, Russ himself badly mauled by the talon of Horus, saved only by the desperate sacrifice of his warriors, who piled upon the War Master in a living wall of ceramite and fur and gene-enhanced flesh. The wound Russ inflicted would linger. It was one of many signs that the power coursing through Horus was beginning to become unstable. The War Master's form began to shift and fluctuate, cycling between different states. Sometimes he looked like the noble lunar wolf of old. Sometimes he appeared as the War Master in his terrible glory. Sometimes he was the empowered being who had walked through the gate on Molech. And sometimes, in his worst moments, he was nothing but a dark maw of chaotic energy, a thing that had ceased to be Horus Lupercal in any meaningful sense and had become merely a vessel for the dark god's malice. His own first captain saw the change. Abaddon, who had followed Horus with absolute devotion since the tunnels of Chthoniya, began to grow disgusted with what his Primarch was becoming. This was no longer the charismatic leader who had inspired love and loyalty in everyone around him. This was increasingly a creature of chaos, commanding through fear rather than charisma, spending long periods in a comatose state within a pocket dimension called Lupercal's Court, attended by the word-bearer sorcerer Zardu Layak. Even Lorgar, the Primarch, who had done more than anyone except Erebus to engineer Horus's fall, Ernlot looked upon the War Master with something approaching pity. Before being exiled by Horus for attempting a coup, Lorgar told the War Master that he had become such a slave to chaos that even the original architect of the corruption felt sorry for him. Coming from the man who had set the entire catastrophe in motion, it was a judgment of devastating finality. As the months of the siege wore on, Horus deteriorated further. He began to display signs of senility, recalling past glories as though they were happening in the present, losing track of time and place. The four gods were burning through their vessel, consuming the man in order to fuel the weapon. Horus Lupercal, the brilliant tactician, the beloved leader, the favored son, was being hollowed out from within, his humanity consumed by the very power he had sought. And yet the march continued. The fleets moved, the legions fought, world after world burned in the War Master's wake, and the light of Terra grew steadily brighter on the horizon. The siege of Terra, the walls of heaven. The siege of the Imperial Palace on Terra was the culmination of everything. 7 years of galactic civil war, millions of worlds burning, countless billions dead, all of it funneling down to this single point in space and time, the throne world of humanity, the seat of the Emperor's power, the place where the dream of the Imperium had been born, and where it would either survive or die. Horus arrived with the largest concentration of traitor forces ever assembled. His fleet filled the skies above Terra like a second sky, a canopy of warships and transports and hulking battle barges that blotted out the stars. Beneath him, the Imperial Palace sprawled across the surface of Terra like a continent unto itself, its walls rising kilometers into the polluted atmosphere, its defenses designed by Rogel Dawn, the greatest military architect the Imperium had ever produced. Behind those walls waited the Imperial Fists, the Blood Angels, the White Scars, the Legio Custodes, the Sisters of Silence, and billions of Imperial Army soldiers and civilian defenders. 3 Primarchs stood against Horus. Rogel Dawn, the Praetorian, immovable as granite, his mind a fortress as impregnable as the walls he had built. Jagatai Khan, the Warhawk, whose white scars fought with the fluid, aggressive mobility that had made them feared across 1,000 worlds. And Sanguinius, the great angel, the most beloved of all the Primarchs, as whose golden wings and noble bearing had made him a figure of almost religious reverence across the Imperium. Sanguinius knew he was going to die. He had seen it. The gift of foresight that ran through his bloodline, the same psychic current that would one day manifest in his sons as the Black Rage and the Red Thirst, had shown him his own death with crystal clarity. He knew he would face Horus. He knew how the confrontation would end, and he went to that confrontation anyway, not out of ignorance or false hope, but out of a deliberate, conscious choice to sacrifice himself for the chance that his death might create the opening the Emperor needed to defeat the War Master. That is perhaps the most heartbreaking element of the siege of Terra. Sanguinius chose his fate. He walked into the jaws of death with his eyes open and his wings spread, knowing that he would never walk out again. And he did it because he loved his father, and because he believed that some things are worth dying for. The siege itself was a nightmare of industrial-scale violence. The traitor legions hit the palace from every direction, supported by corrupted Titan legions, demon engines, summoned warp entities, and billions of cultists, mutants, and renegade Imperial army soldiers who had been promised glory or simply driven mad by chaos. The World Eaters, led by the bestial Angron, who had by this point ascended to become a demon prince of Khorne, threw themselves at the walls with mindless fury. The Death Guard spread pestilence and plague through the trenches. The Thousand Suns, led by the shattered and bitter Magnus the Red, brought their sorcerous powers to bear against the palace's psychic defenses. Maes the Emperor's children, once the most refined and elegant of the legions, had degenerated into sensation-seeking monsters who committed atrocities that defied description. The defenders held. Day after day, week after week, they held. Dawn's fortifications proved their worth time and again, channeling the traitor assaults into killing fields where the palace's guns could extract a terrible toll. The White Scars launched lightning raids behind the enemy lines, destroying supply dumps and disrupting communications. The Blood Angels fought with a ferocity that bordered on the supernatural, their Primarch's proximity driving them to heights of martial fury that amazed and sometimes frightened even their allies. Sanguinius himself was everywhere. When he defended the Eternity Gate alone, when the horror of the assault overwhelmed every other defender who attempted to hold that crucial position. He broke the greater demon Kabanda, a creature of Khorne that had haunted his legion since the Cygnus campaign. When Angron himself descended from the sky, bellowing challenges and radiating killing fury, Sanguinius faced him without flinching, acknowledging his fallen brother with a salute, before declaring that their battle would come another day. Even in the apocalypse, the angel maintained his dignity. His courage was a beacon that kept the defenders fighting when all reason said they should have surrendered. But the walls could not hold forever. No wall can. The traitor forces were too numerous, too powerful, too desperate. Slowly, brutally, as they ground their way through the outer defenses, sections of the wall fell. Bastions that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. The defenders were pushed back, fighting for every corridor, every courtyard, every stairway within the palace complex. And Horus watched it all from the bridge of the vengeful spirit, orbiting above terror like a dark moon. He was barely present in the real world anymore. His physical form spent long periods in the pocket dimension of Lupercal's court, attended by sorcerers and demons. His consciousness extended into the warp, where he fought a parallel war against the Emperor on the psychic plane. The charismatic leader, who had once inspired devotion through personal magnetism, now commanded through fear and raw power. His sons barely recognized him. His allies served him out of terror rather than loyalty. The tactical situation was dire for both sides, but time was running out for Horus. Word reached the War Master that loyalist reinforcements were converging on terror. The Ultramarines under Rabut Gilliman had broken free of the word-bearers at Calth and were making all speed for the throne world. The Dark Angels under Lionel Johnson were also approaching. Even the shattered Space Wolves, licking their wounds after their mauling at Horus's hands, were moving to join the defense. If these forces arrived before Horus could take the palace, the siege would be broken, and the traitors would be caught between the defenders and the relieving forces. Horus had gambled everything on speed. He had burned through his forces with reckless abandon, throwing them at the walls in wave after wave, accepting casualties that would have been unthinkable in any normal military campaign. And now the gamble was failing. The defenders were bloodied, battered, reduced to a fraction of their original strength, but they were still fighting. The palace still stood. So Horus made one final gamble, the most desperate, the most audacious, and ultimately the most fatal. He lowered the void shields of the vengeful spirit. The final gambit, father against son. Think about what that decision meant. Void shields are the primary defense of any warship. They are the barrier between the crew and the infinite hostility of space combat. Lowering them is equivalent to a medieval knight removing his armor in the middle of a battle. It is an act of supreme confidence or supreme desperation, and in Horus's case, it was both. By lowering his shields, Horus was sending an invitation that he knew the Emperor could not refuse. "Come to me," the gesture said. "Come and face me, father. Let us settle this the way it was always going to be settled. Not with armies and sieges and the slow grinding of attrition, but between the two of us. Father and son, creator and creation. The greatest psychic power in the galaxy against the mightiest warrior the Chaos Gods had ever forged." It was a trap. Horus knew that the Emperor would come. He knew that the master of mankind would sense the lowered shields and recognize the challenge for what it was, and he had prepared his ship accordingly. The vengeful spirit was no longer a warship in any conventional sense. It had become a floating temple to chaos, its corridors warped and twisted by warp energy, at its decks crawling with demons and monsters and things that should not have existed in the material universe. Anyone who teleported aboard would be scattered, disoriented, forced to fight their way through a gauntlet of horrors before reaching the War Master. The Emperor knew it was a trap. Of course he did. He was the most powerful psyker in human history, a being who had lived for tens of thousands of years and who could perceive the currents of the warp with a clarity that no other entity could match. He knew what awaited him on the vengeful spirit. He knew the risks. But he also knew that this was the only way. The siege was failing. The defenders were dying. If he did not act now, everything he had built, everything humanity had achieved, would be swept away by the tide of chaos. So he rose from the golden throne, leaving its maintenance to his trusted friend and advisor, Malcador the Sigillite, who would sacrifice his own life to keep the throne functioning in the Emperor's absence. The assault force that teleported onto the vengeful spirit was small but elite. The Emperor himself, Rogel Dawn, Sanguinius, companies of Imperial Fists and Blood Angels veterans, squads of the Legio Custodes, the Emperor's personal guard, the finest individual warriors in the Imperium. It was a concentrated hammer blow of the Loyalists' greatest champions, aimed directly at the heart of the traitor cause. And then the teleportation went wrong. Whether through the deliberate interference of the Chaos Gods or through the warp corruption that saturated the vengeful spirit, the Loyalist force was scattered throughout the ship. And instead of arriving together as a unified strike force, they materialized in scattered groups across the vast warship, separated from each other and immediately beset by the nightmarish creatures that now called the vengeful spirit home. Each group fought its way through corridors that had become something out of a fever dream, passages that twisted and reformed, walls that bled, floors that opened onto screaming voids of nothing. Demons emerged from the shadows. Corrupted space marines attacked from ambush. Things that had no names and should have had no existence clawed at the Loyalists from every direction. And it was Sanguinius who reached Horus first. The Angel of Baal had fought his way through the ship with a fury that transcended anything his blood angels had ever witnessed. Already wounded from the defense of the palace, and already exhausted from weeks of continuous combat, he pressed forward with the knowledge that his death awaited him, and the acceptance that this death had meaning. Every step brought him closer to the moment he had foreseen. Every corridor cleared was one more passage closer to the throne room of the vengeful spirit, where his brother waited. When Sanguinius entered that final chamber, he found Horus waiting for him. The War Master was barely recognizable as the brother Sanguinius had once called his closest friend among the Primarchs. The Chaos Gods had swollen Horus with power until he was less a person and more a force of nature, a walking nexus of warp energy barely contained within a physical form. The sea-green armor of the Sons of Horus was blackened and warped. The talon of Horus, that terrible lightning claw, are crackled with energies that were painful to look upon. Horus offered Sanguinius a chance to join him. One last time, the War Master extended the hand of brotherhood to the angel, promising him power, glory, a place at the right hand of the new order that would arise from the ashes of the Emperor's failed dream. Sanguinius refused. He had always known he would refuse. The vision had shown him everything, and he had accepted it long ago. They fought, and it was not a fight that Sanguinius could win. The chaos-empowered Horus was beyond anything that any single Primarch could match. The combined power of 4 gods flowed through him, augmenting his already formidable abilities to levels that defied comprehension. Sanguinius fought with everything he had. The genetic perfection of his Primarch physiology, pushed beyond its limits by sheer willpower and devotion to his cause. Some accounts say he managed to crack Horus's armor, creating a small but significant breach in the War Master's defenses. Whether this detail is literal truth or later embellishment, the symbolic power of the gesture remains. Even in death, the angel struck a blow against the darkness. Horus killed Sanguinius. The beloved angel, the noblest of the Primarchs, the being who had been so universally admired that even Horus himself had once suggested Sanguinius would have made a better War Master, died aboard the vengeful spirit. His body, those magnificent wings broken and stained with blood, was left at Horus's feet like a trophy. The psychic shockwave of Sanguinius's death rippled across the warp, and every blood angel felt it. Every psyker in the system felt it. And the Emperor, fighting his way through the ship toward the throne room, felt it like a blade driven into his own heart. When the Emperor finally entered the chamber, he found what he had feared. The body of his beloved Sanguinius, broken and discarded, and standing over it, radiating power and malice in equal measure, Horus. The War Master spoke. He mocked his father, calling him foolish for refusing the power that the Chaos Gods offered. He proclaimed himself the rightful ruler of humanity. He claimed to have bent the Chaos Gods to his will, to to be their master rather than their servant. He offered the emperor one final chance to kneel. The emperor looked upon his most beloved son and saw only the ruins of what Horus had once been, the brilliant tactician, the charismatic leader, the boy from Chthoniya who had smiled and made everyone around him feel important. All of it was gone, consumed by the power that now animated Horus's flesh. What stood before the emperor was not his son. It was a weapon wearing his son's face. And still, the emperor hesitated. Even now, faced with the body of Sanguinius at his feet and the twisted mockery of his favored child before him, the emperor could not bring himself to use his full power. Some part of him still hoped, still loved, still believed that somewhere beneath the layers of corruption and power and madness, the real Horus might still exist. Their battle was fought on multiple levels simultaneously. In the physical world, they clashed with weapons of terrible power, as the Emperor's flaming sword against the talon of Horus and the great mace called Worldbreaker. In the Imperium, they fought a psychic duel of staggering intensity, their minds locked in combat across dimensions that mortal beings could not perceive, let alone survive. Horus was winning. The Emperor's reluctance to use his full power was a handicap that the War Master exploited mercilessly. Blow after blow landed on the master of mankind, each one carrying the combined force of 4 gods' malice. The Emperor was wounded, grievously, mortally, his golden armor shattered, his body broken, his blood flowing freely. And then something happened that shattered the last of the Emperor's illusions. The accounts vary on the specific details. In some tellings, an alone custodian named Olanius Pius threw himself between the Emperor and a killing blow from Horus, and the War Master killed the mortal man without a moment's hesitation. In other versions, it was a space marine or an Imperial army soldier who made the sacrifice. In the most recent and detailed account from the Siege of Terra novel series, the circumstances are more complex, involving the intervention of multiple parties and the Emperor's final, agonizing decision to separate his own compassion and humanity from his psychic arsenal. Whatever the specific trigger, the result was the same. The Emperor saw, with absolute finality, that Horus was gone. The son he had loved was dead, consumed by the power that had promised him everything and taken everything instead. What remained was a puppet of chaos, a vessel for the dark god's will. And if it was not destroyed immediately, the ruinous powers would simply resurrect it again and again, using it as an eternal weapon against everything the Emperor had built. The Emperor unleashed his full psychic power, not the restrained, careful application of force that he had employed throughout the battle. Everything, the totality of his incomprehensible psychic might, focused into a single lance of pure warp energy that pierced through Horus's defenses and ripped through his body like a spear of concentrated sunlight through shadow. In that final moment, as the power of the Chaos Gods was driven from his flesh, Horus came back. For one brief, terrible instant, the real Horus looked out through his own eyes. He saw what he had done. He saw the body of Sanguinius. He saw his father, broken and bleeding. He saw the 10,000 years of darkness that his actions had set in motion. And he wept. A single tear, some accounts say. One tear from the eye of the greatest traitor humanity has ever known. He begged his father for forgiveness. He begged the Emperor to end it, to kill him completely before the Chaos Gods could take hold of him again. The Emperor obliged. He gathered the last of his strength and unleashed a final psychic strike that did not merely kill Horus, but obliterated his soul entirely. The Chaos Gods could resurrect a dead body. They could repair damaged flesh and restore failed organs, but they could not reconstitute a soul that had been annihilated by the full power of the Emperor of mankind. Horus was not merely killed, he was erased, unmade, removed from existence so completely that even the gods of chaos could not bring him back. The War Master was dead, the heresy was over, and the Emperor was dying. Rogel Dawn found them in the throne room. The broken body of the Emperor, the corpse of Sanguinius with its shattered wings, and the remains of Horus, whatever was left after the Emperor's final devastating strike. Dawn carried his father from the vengeful spirit and brought him back to the Imperial Palace, where he was placed upon the Golden Throne. The device that had been designed to maintain the Webway project was now repurposed as a life support system for the most powerful being in human history, keeping him alive in a state of perpetual agony, neither truly living nor fully dead. The Emperor has sat upon that throne for 10,000 years. He has not spoken, he has not moved. He has endured an eternity of suffering to maintain the Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that allows humanity's ships to navigate the warp, and to keep the Webway breach beneath the palace sealed against the demonic forces that would pour through it if his concentration ever wavered. This is Horus's legacy, not just a civil war, not just a rebellion, an eternal prison for humanity's greatest hope, a golden age destroyed, a species condemned to 10 millennia of stagnation, decay, and endless war. Everything the Emperor had dreamed of, the great human civilization that would have spanned the stars, the Webway project that would have freed humanity from the corrupting influence of the warp, all of it died on the deck of the vengeful spirit alongside the Warmaster, while the Black Legion and 10,000 years of consequence. The death of Horus did not end the war. It ended the heresy, but the wars that followed, the Great Scouring, the retreat of the traitor legions into the Eye of Terror, the Legion Wars that tore the traitor forces apart as they turned on each other. These conflicts raged for years after the Warmaster's fall. For the sons of Horus specifically, the aftermath was catastrophic. They had been the golden boys of the Great Crusade, the legion that bore the name of the Emperor's favorite son. Now that name was a curse. Their Primarch was dead. Their cause had failed, and the other traitor legions, bitter from defeat and looking for someone to blame, turned their fury on the ones who had led them to destruction. The sons of Horus retreated to the world of Millennium in the Eye of Terror, where they built a tomb for Horus's body and sank into a torpor of grief and directionless fury. They did not even bother to choose a new commander who could possibly fill the Warmaster's boots, who would even want to try. The Emperor's children, who had fled the siege of Terror before the final battle and thus escaped with more of their strength intact than most traitor legions, saw an opportunity. They attacked Millennium, scattered the sons of Horus, and stole the body of Horus himself. The gene sorcerer Fabius Bile took the Primarch's corpse and used it to create clones, attempting to resurrect the Warmaster through genetic manipulation and dark science. The very idea of Horus clones was an abomination to most of the sons of Horus. It was a desecration of everything their father had been. It is a reduction of the greatest Primarch to mere biological material to be copied and discarded. The disgust was nearly universal, and it was this disgust that finally stirred Abaddon from his self-imposed exile. The first captain of the Lunar Wolves, the last surviving member of the original Mournival, had wandered alone into the Eye of Terror after the heresy, broken by Horus's death and sick of war. He had spent years hunting monsters and thinking about who he was and what he wanted to become. And when he emerged from that wandering, he was no longer merely Abaddon, first captain. He was something new, something dangerous. Abaddon led an assault on the Emperor's Children fortress where Horus's remains and clones were held. He personally destroyed the clone of his Primarch, killing it with the Talon of Horus, as the same weapon that Horus had used to slay Sanguinius. It was an act of supreme symbolic violence. By killing the clone, Abaddon was not merely disposing of an abomination. He was declaring that the age of Horus was over. The sons of Horus were dead. A new era was beginning. The Legion painted their armor black. Whether in mourning for their fallen father, or in shame at their failure, or simply as a way of starting fresh, the symbolism was unmistakable. They were no longer the sons of Horus. They were the Black Legion, and their new master, Abaddon the Despoiler, would lead them on what he called the Long War, a campaign of vengeance and conquest that would span 10,000 years. Abaddon rejected the worship of any single chaos god, dedicating himself instead to chaos undivided, just as Horus had been. But unlike Horus, Abaddon refused to become a puppet. He used chaos rather than allowing it to use him, drawing on the power of the warp without surrendering his will to its masters. He had watched what the Chaos Gods had done to Horus, how they had consumed the man he loved and left nothing but a hollow shell of power and madness. Abaddon would not make the same mistake. He would be the master of chaos, not its slave. Over the following millennia, Abaddon launched 13 Black Crusades against the Imperium. Each one appeared to be a simple military assault from the Eye of Terror, and each one was repelled with varying degrees of difficulty by the forces of the Imperium. But the Black Crusades had a secret purpose that went beyond mere conquest. Abaddon was systematically destroying ancient monoliths and structures that held back the tides of the warp, weakening the barrier between real space and the immaterium as part of a plan called the Crimson Path. His ultimate goal was to expand the Eye of Terror until it swallowed terror itself. The 13th Black Crusade proved to be the culmination of this plan. Abaddon's forces descended upon the fortress world of Cadia, the linchpin of the imperial defenses around the Eye of Terror, and after a devastating campaign, Cadia fell. The planet was destroyed, and with it, the great pylons that had helped keep the Eye of Terror contained. The warp rift expanded dramatically, creating a galaxy-spanning tear in reality called the Great Rift, the Cicatrix Maledictum, that split the Imperium in half. And all of this, every last bit of it, traces back to Horus. Without Horus, there is no heresy. Without the heresy, there is no golden throne. Without the golden throne, the emperor does not sit in eternal torment while his imperium crumbles around him. Without the fall of the favored sun, the entire architecture of the 41st millennium collapses. The feudal theocracy, the worship of the emperor as a god he never wanted to be, the Inquisition and the ecclesiarchy, and the endless cycles of crusade and counter-crusade, none of it exists without the choices Horus made on Davin and the consequences that followed. Why Horus is the most important Primarch? Let us step back now. Let us take a breath and look at the full sweep of what we have discussed. Because the question in the title of this video is not simply who Horus was or what he did. The question is why he matters more than any other Primarch. And after everything we have explored together, I believe the answer is clear. And other Primarchs have stories that are arguably more dramatic. Sanguinius's sacrifice is more noble. Guilliman's return in the 41st millennium is more hopeful. Magnus's fall is more tragic in some ways, a scholar undone by the very knowledge he loved. Angron's story is more pitiable, a warrior broken by forces beyond his control before he ever had a chance to become who he might have been. But none of them are as consequential as Horus. Horus is the axis upon which the entire setting turns. He is the reason the 41st millennium looks the way it does. Without his fall, the Imperium would be a fundamentally different place. Perhaps it would have succeeded in its original mission. Perhaps the Webway project would have been completed, and humanity would have been freed from its dependence on the chaos-tainted warp. Or perhaps the Primarchs would have continued to work together, brothers united in common cause, pushing the boundaries of human civilization further and further into the darkness between stars. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the flaws in the Emperor's plan would have surfaced in some other way. Perhaps another Primarch would have fallen. Perhaps the Chaos Gods would have found another instrument for their malice. We cannot know. We can only see the history that actually happened, and in that history, Horus is the fulcrum. But his importance goes beyond mere causality. Horus matters because his story is so deeply, painfully human. Strip away the power armor and the genetic engineering and the warp sorcery, and what you have is a story about a gifted child who felt abandoned by his father. A leader who was given enormous responsibility without the support he needed to carry it. A man whose legitimate grievances were exploited by forces that cared nothing for his well-being and wanted only to use him as a weapon against everything he had once stood for. There is something universal in that story. We have all known people who were brilliant and charismatic and fundamentally flawed, people whose strengths and weaknesses were so intertwined that you could not separate one from the other. People who could have been great if only they had received the right guidance at the right moment. People who fell because the support structures around them failed at precisely the wrong time. Horus is a warning. He is a reminder that no one is so great that they cannot fall, and that the fall of the great causes far more damage than the fall of the ordinary. He is a reminder that leadership carries with it a burden that can break even the strongest shoulders, and that the gap between a hero and a villain is often nothing more than a moment of weakness exploited by the right enemy at the right time. And he is a reminder that love is not enough. The Emperor loved Horus. Horus loved the Emperor. The bond between them was genuine and deep and powerful. But love without communication, without trust, without the willingness to share your fears and your secrets and your plans, love like that is a foundation built on sand. When the storms came, when Erebus and the Chaos Gods brought their full cunning to bear against that bond, it crumbled because it had never been tested. Because the Emperor had never told Horus why he left. Because Horus had never told the Emperor how much that departure hurt. In the silence between father and son, the galaxy burned. That is why Horus is the most important Primarch. Not because he was the strongest, or the smartest, or the most noble, but because his story contains within it the essential truth of the Warhammer 40,000 universe. That in the grim darkness of the far future, the greatest enemy is not the alien or the demon or the heretic. The greatest enemy is the distance between those who should be closest. The words left unspoken, the trust left unearned, the love that withers in the darkness because no one thought to bring it into the light. Horus Lupercal is dead. His soul was obliterated by his father's hand 10,000 years ago. Yet his name is a curse across 1,000,000 worlds. His legacy is an eternity of war and suffering and decay. But his story endures, and as long as that story is told, as long as people sit in the darkness and listen to the tale of the favored son who fell, there is a chance that the lesson will be learned. That the next time a father has a secret, he will share it with his son. That the next time a son feels abandoned, he will speak his hurt aloud rather than let it fester in silence. That the next time the darkness whispers sweet lies in a moment of weakness, someone will have the strength to say no. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But in the story of Horus Lupercal, there is also something else. There is the memory of what might have been, and in that memory, faint and flickering, like a candle in a hurricane, there is the most dangerous thing in all the galaxy. There is hope. That somewhere, somehow, the mistakes of the past will not be repeated. That the golden age that Horus destroyed was not humanity's last chance. That the light the Emperor tried to kindle was not extinguished forever, but merely banked, waiting for the moment when it can be fanned back into flame. Whether that moment will ever come is a question that 10,000 years of war have not yet answered. But the fact that the question can still be asked, that the story of Horus can still be told as a warning rather than a prophecy, that is something. In the end, that might be enough. But before we close this chapter, there is more to explore, more layers to peel back, more angles from which to examine this man and the wound he left upon the galaxy. So let us go deeper. Show the nature of charisma. What made Horus different? There is a question that sits at the heart of everything we have discussed so far, a question that demands more attention than we have given it. What was it about Horus specifically that made the Chaos Gods choose him as their instrument? After all, the ruinous powers had access to all 20 Primarchs. Many of them had flaws that were far more obvious, far more exploitable than anything Horus carried within him. Angron was a slave to rage. Mortarion harbored a deep bitterness toward his father. Cursor was clinically insane. Lorgar was already in their pocket. Any of these Primarchs might have served as the spearhead of a rebellion against the Emperor, but the Chaos Gods did not choose a broken Primarch. They chose the best one. They chose the Primarch who was beloved by his brothers, as trusted by the Emperor, respected by the Imperium at large. They chose Horus because corrupting the best was always more devastating than corrupting the worst. A rebellion led by Angron or Curze would have been terrible, yes, but it would have been contained. The loyalist Primarchs would have united immediately against a brother they already distrusted. The loyalty of the Imperium's military forces would have held firm. But a rebellion led by Horus, that was different. When word came that the War Master had turned traitor, the reaction across the Imperium was not immediate mobilization. It was disbelief, denial. The man who had fought beside the Emperor for 30 years, the Primarch who had been chosen above all others to lead humanity's armies, the brother who had earned the love and respect of nearly every other Primarch. Yes, he could not have betrayed the Emperor. There must be a mistake. There must be a misunderstanding. That moment of hesitation, that brief window of denial before the reality of the situation sank in, cost the Imperium dearly. It gave Horus time to consolidate his forces, to purge the loyalists from his ranks, to position his traitor legions for the devastating blows that would follow. And it was only possible because Horus was who he was, because he was trusted, because he was loved. This is the cruel genius of the Chaos God's strategy. They did not simply corrupt a powerful warrior. They corrupted a symbol. They took the living embodiment of everything the Imperium aspired to be and turned him into its destroyer. The message was devastating in its simplicity. If even Horus can fall, then no one is safe. And if even the Emperor's most beloved son can be turned, then the darkness is stronger than the light. That message has echoed across 10,000 years of imperial history. It is the foundation of the paranoia that defines the Imperium of the 41st millennium. The Inquisition exists because of Horus, the obsessive vetting of loyalty, the witch hunts, the burning of heretics, the reflexive suspicion that greets any deviation from orthodoxy. All of it can be traced back to the moment when the most trusted man in the galaxy proved that trust can be weaponized. Let me tell you something about the way Horus interacted with people, because it is essential to understanding why his betrayal cut so deep. Every other Primarch had a particular way of relating to those around them. Guilliman was administrative and efficient. He managed his relationships the way he managed his chapters and his supply lines, with care and competence, but also with a certain professional distance. The Lion was aloof and secretive. Russ was boisterous and competitive. Sanguinius was kind but untouchable, his angelic nature creating a barrier of reverence that made true intimacy difficult. Horus was none of these things. Horus had the extraordinary ability to make every person he spoke with feel like the most important person in the room. He remembered names. He remembered faces. He remembered the small details of people's lives, the kinds of things that most leaders never bothered to learn. He would recall a sergeant's homeworld, ask about a remembrancer's family, inquire about a fleet officer's recent promotion. Yet he spoke the rough dialect of Chthoniya with his fellow Chthonians because it made them feel like he was one of them. He adopted the customs and courtesies of newly contacted worlds because it showed respect for their cultures. Some of this was calculated. Horus was far too intelligent to be entirely unconscious of the effect his behavior had on others. He knew that personal attention bred loyalty, that remembered names bought devotion, that a Primarch who made time for the rank and file was worth 10 who remained locked in their command chambers. But much of it was also genuine. Horus really did care about the people around him. He really did want to know their names and hear their stories and understand their concerns. That capacity for empathy was hardwired into his Primarch physiology, a design feature built into his genetic template by the Emperor himself. And that is what made the corruption so insidious. When chaos whispered in Horus's ear, it did not simply appeal to his ambition or his pride, it appealed to his empathy. The Chaos Gods showed him visions of his sons discarded like used tools, his brothers forgotten, the soldiers he had led and loved cast aside by an emperor who viewed them as nothing more than means to an end. They told him that by rebelling, he was not betraying his people. He was protecting them. He was saving them from a future where everything they had sacrificed would be forgotten and everything they had built would be taken from them. It was a masterful manipulation precisely because it leveraged Horus's greatest strength against him. His care for others became the channel through which corruption flowed. His love for his legion became the justification for betraying the Imperium. His devotion to his brothers became the mechanism by which he recruited half of them to join his rebellion. This is a lesson that the Warhammer 40,000 universe teaches again and again, in story after story, across 10,000 years of fictional history. The greatest weapons are not bolters or chainswords or virus bombs. The greatest weapons are the ones that turn your own virtues against you. And there was no virtue more powerful than the love that Horus Lupercal inspired in everyone who knew him. The Interrex and the road not taken. There is a moment early in the Horus heresy narrative that deserves particular attention. Because it represents perhaps the last point at which the catastrophe could have been averted. That moment is the encounter with the Interrex. The Interrex were a small but advanced human civilization that had developed independently of the Imperium during the Age of Strife. What made them remarkable was not their military power or their technological achievement, though both were considerable. What made them remarkable was their philosophy. The Interrex had learned to coexist with certain alien species. They had developed an understanding of chaos that was more sophisticated and nuanced than anything the Imperium possessed. They did not simply pretend the warp did not exist, as the imperial truth demanded. They acknowledged its dangers and developed countermeasures against them. And they kept weapons of chaos locked away in carefully guarded museums, studied and understood rather than destroyed and denied. When Horus and the Lunar Wolves made contact with the Interrex, there was a genuine possibility of peaceful incorporation. The Interrex were willing to negotiate. They were willing to share their knowledge of chaos, knowledge that could have fundamentally altered the Imperium's ability to resist the ruinous powers. Horus himself was intrigued by their approach, impressed by their sophistication, drawn to the possibility that the Great Crusade did not always have to end in bloodshed. But Erebus destroyed this possibility with a single act of calculated sabotage. During the diplomatic negotiations, the word-bearer stole the Kynabrach anathami from the Interrex Museum, the same blade that would later be used to wound Horus on Davin's moon. The theft was discovered, the Interrex blamed the Lunar Wolves, and a promising diplomatic contact collapsed into open warfare. The significance of this event cannot be overstated. The Interrex represented a road not taken, a version of humanity that had found a way to deal with chaos through understanding rather than denial. If the knowledge they possessed had been incorporated into the Imperium, the Emperor's project might have been completed without the catastrophic failure that the heresy represented. The warrior lodges might have been identified as vectors of corruption. The nature of the anathemy might have been understood before it was used against Horus. The entire chain of events that led from Davin to Terra might have been disrupted at its very source. But Erebus ensured that none of this would happen. He stole the blade, he destroyed the alliance, and he set in motion the sequence of events that would lead to Horus's corruption and the Imperium's near destruction. And the bitter irony is that Horus himself never knew. He went to his grave, or rather to his obliteration, never understanding that the encounter with the Interrex had been deliberately sabotaged by the very people who were supposed to be his allies. This is another layer of tragedy in Horus's story. He was not merely corrupted by chaos. He was systematically denied every opportunity to resist that corruption. Every potential lifeline was cut. Every possible ally was turned away. Every source of truth was silenced or discredited. By the time Horus entered the Temple of the Serpent Lodge on Davin, he was already surrounded by enemies wearing the faces of friends. The trap had been built around him over the course of decades, so carefully and so completely that by the time it was sprung, he never had a real chance of escape. Does that absolve him of responsibility? No. Horus was a Primarch. He possessed intellect and willpower that far exceeded anything a normal human could claim. He could have questioned more. He could have resisted harder. He could have reached out to his brothers for help instead of allowing his resentment to fester in isolation. Other Primarchs faced similar temptations and chose differently. Sanguinius saw his own death at Horus's hands and walked toward it anyway, choosing loyalty over survival. Gilliman was offered the chance to build his own empire in Imperium Secundus and ultimately rejected it in favor of rushing to Terra's defense. But understanding the depth of the manipulation that surrounded Horus does add a dimension of tragedy to his fall that simple villainy cannot provide. He was not a monster. He was a good man who was systematically isolated, exploited, and ultimately consumed by forces that cared nothing for his well-being and wanted only to use his light to cast the longest possible shadow. The psychology of betrayal. Why Horus could not turn back. There is a moment during Horus's confrontation with Leman Russ aboard the Vengeful Spirit that illuminates something essential about the Warmaster's psychology. When the spear of Russ temporarily cleansed Horus of the corruption that had been poured into him since Molech, Russ looked into his brother's eyes and saw the real Horus looking back. For one brief, shining moment, the favored son was himself again, and Russ offered him a chance. Come back. Return to the Emperor. Let the healing begin. Horus refused. Even momentarily freed from the direct influence of the Chaos Gods, even staring into the face of a brother who still loved him enough to offer mercy instead of death, Horus chose to continue down the path of rebellion. Why? The answer lies not in the warp corruption, but in something far more mundane and far more human. Shame. Horus had already ordered the virus bombing of Istvan III. He had already presided over the drop site massacre. And he had already sent his brothers to their deaths and watched his own sons murder their comrades. The blood on his hands was too deep, too thick, too impossible to wash away. Imagine standing at that crossroads. Imagine being offered forgiveness after everything you have done. The temptation to accept would be overwhelming, but so would the fear, because accepting forgiveness means accepting responsibility. It means looking at the full scope of what you have done without the comforting lies that chaos provided to justify it. It means facing Rogel Dawn and explaining why you ordered the deaths of his brother's sons. It means facing the Emperor and admitting that you were too weak to resist the whispers of entities you should have been strong enough to ignore. For a being defined by his pride, by his need to be the best, and by his desperate desire to be worthy of the title of Warmaster, that admission of failure would have been more devastating than any physical wound. Horus could not turn back because turning back meant acknowledging that he was not the man he had always believed himself to be. It meant admitting that the Emperor's faith in him had been misplaced. It meant becoming, in his own eyes, the thing he feared most, a failure. And so, he chose the only path that his pride would allow. Forward, into the darkness, toward terror, and the confrontation that both he and the Emperor knew would end in death. Not because he believed he could win, not really, but because winning or losing no longer mattered. What mattered was that he could not bear to stop. To stop was to think was to feel, and to feel was to confront the full horror of what he had become. This is perhaps the most human element of Horus's story, not the genetic engineering, not the warp sorcery, not the galaxy-spanning warfare, but the simple, devastating truth that sometimes people continue down a destructive path, not because they cannot see the alternative, but because they are too ashamed to take it, because the pain of admitting they were wrong feels worse than the pain of continuing to be wrong, because their pride has become their prison, and they would rather burn than ask for the key. Horus burned, and he took the galaxy with him. The weight of a name, from lunar wolves to sons of Horus to Black Legion names matter. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, where symbols carry the weight of millennia and traditions are preserved with religious fervor, The name of a Space Marine Legion is more than a label. It is an identity. It is a declaration of purpose. It is the banner under which warriors live and die and are remembered. The 16th Legion bore 3 names over the course of its history, and each name tells a chapter of the story we have been exploring. They began as the Lunar Wolves, a name earned in blood during the first pacification of Luna, when the Legion proved its worth against the techno-barbarian clans that held Terra's moon. It was a good name, a clean name. It carried with it the imagery of swift, ruthless hunters who struck from the shadows with precision and purpose. The Lunar Wolves were the Emperor's blade, sharp and reliable, and always pointed at the enemy. When the Emperor suggested they rename themselves the Sons of Horus after the triumph at Ulanor, while it was meant as an honor, but it was also a subtle shift in identity. The Lunar Wolves belonged to the Emperor. The Sons of Horus belonged to their Primarch. The name change reflected a transfer of loyalty, a narrowing of focus from the broader Imperium to the personal cult of a single individual. With the benefit of hindsight, it is possible to see in this renaming the seeds of the catastrophe that followed. A legion named after a man is a legion whose identity is bound to that man's choices. When Horus fell, the Sons of Horus fell with him because their very name chained them to his fate. And then, after the heresy, came the third name, the Black Legion. This was not a name given in honor or celebration. It was a name born from grief and shame and a desperate desire to start over. When Abaddon ordered his warriors to paint their armor black and abandon the name of Horus, he was performing a kind of exorcism. He was trying to sever the connection between the Legion and the Primarch who had led them to ruin. He was declaring that the future of the 16th Legion would not be defined by the failures of the past. Whether he succeeded is debatable. The Black Legion may have abandoned Horus's name, but they carry his legacy in every battle they fight. The talon of Horus, the weapon that killed Sanguinius, hangs from Abaddon's arm. The vengeful spirit, Horus's flagship, carries Abaddon across the stars. The long war that Abaddon wages against the Imperium is the same war that Horus started, continued by different hands toward the same ultimate goal. You cannot escape a legacy by changing your name. But you cannot outrun the past by painting your armor a different color. Horus is dead, but his shadow stretches across 10,000 years of history, and every warrior who fights under the banner of the Black Legion walks in that shadow, whether they acknowledge it or not. The tragedy of the father. We have spent a great deal of time discussing Horus, and rightly so. But to fully understand the weight of his story, we need to spend a moment with the other party in this tragedy, the Emperor of mankind. The Emperor is not a sympathetic figure in the traditional sense. He is manipulative, secretive, willing to sacrifice individuals and entire civilizations in pursuit of his grand design. He created the Primarchs not as children to be loved, but as tools to be used, weapons in a war that he had been planning for millennia. When one of those tools broke, when Angron's butcher's nails destroyed his potential, the Emperor did not mourn. He simply adjusted his calculations and moved on. And yet, with Horus, there was something different, something that went beyond utility. The Emperor and Horus spent 30 years together, fighting side by side, and in those 3 decades, something happened that may have surprised even the master of mankind. He grew attached. He came to see Horus not merely as a weapon, but as a son, not merely as a commander, but as a companion. The story of the Emperor standing over Horus's unconscious body at the siege of Rylus, killing everything that came near until help arrived, is not the story of a craftsman protecting a valuable tool. It is the story of a parent protecting a child. This attachment was, in many ways, at the Emperor's greatest vulnerability. It was the reason he could not bring himself to use his full power against Horus during their final confrontation. It was the reason he held back, even as Horus's blows were tearing him apart, hoping against hope that somewhere beneath the corruption, the son he remembered still existed. It was the reason the Emperor was mortally wounded, because he loved Horus too much to kill him quickly. Some would call this weakness, and perhaps it was. But it is also the most human thing the emperor ever did. In a career spanning millennia, marked by countless acts of cold calculation and ruthless pragmatism, the emperor's moment of greatest humanity was his inability to destroy his own son. He hesitated. He hoped. He paid for that hope with an eternity of suffering. And Horus, in his final moment of clarity, understood this. That single tear, that whispered plea for forgiveness, was the recognition of what he had done not just to the Imperium, but to the man who loved him, the man who had stood over his body and fought off an army, the man who had given him a name and a purpose and a place in the grandest story ever told. Horus saw, in that last moment, the depth of the wound he had inflicted, and the weight of it broke him in a way that all the power of the Chaos Gods never could. This is the heart of the story, not the battles and the betrayals and the cosmic stakes. The heart of the story is a father who could not kill his son, and a son who could not forgive himself. The echoes that never fade. 10,000 years after the Horus heresy, the Imperium of man bears scars that will never heal. The emperor sits upon the golden throne, neither alive nor dead, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psykers every day, whose souls are fed into the ancient machine to keep the master of mankind's consciousness from fading entirely. The Astronomicon, the psychic beacon that guides humanity's ships through the warp, burns with the emperor's power, and without it, interstellar travel would become impossible, and the Imperium would fragment into 1 billion isolated worlds, each one prey to the horrors that lurk in the darkness. The Primarchs are scattered. The loyalists who survived the heresy have vanished one by one into exile, into slumber, into the depths of the warp. Only Guilliman has returned, awakened in the 41st millennium, to find an Imperium that bears no resemblance to the civilization he and his brothers fought to create. He looks upon the bloated, corrupt, a superstitious nightmare that the Imperium has become, and he sees in it the ultimate vindication of Horus's fears. The Emperor is worshipped as a god. The Primarchs are forgotten or mythologized beyond recognition. The imperial truth that they fought to spread across the galaxy has been replaced by exactly the kind of religious hysteria that the Emperor spent 10 millennia trying to prevent. Is this what Horus saw in his visions on Davin? Is this the future that the Chaos Gods showed him, the future that they told him could only be prevented by rebellion? If so, the irony is crushing. The rebellion that was supposed to prevent this future is the very thing that caused it. Horus fought to stop the Emperor from becoming a god, and his rebellion is the reason the Emperor became a god. He fought to prevent the Primarchs from being discarded, and his rebellion is the reason the Primarchs were scattered and lost. He fought to preserve the nobility of the Space Marine legions, and his rebellion is the reason the legions were broken into chapters, their strength divided, their unity destroyed by the very reforms that were enacted to prevent another War Master from ever wielding enough power to threaten the Imperium again. The Codex Astartes, Guilliman's great reorganization of the Space Marines, exists because of Horus. The division of the legions into smaller, more manageable chapters was a direct response to the heresy, a structural safeguard designed to ensure that no single commander would ever again control enough military force to challenge the Imperium. It is one of the most significant organizational changes in imperial history, and it would never have happened if Horus had not demonstrated, in the most devastating way possible, the dangers of concentrating power in the hands of a single individual. The Inquisition exists because of Horus. The vast, shadowy organization that monitors the Imperium for signs of heresy, corruption, and alien infiltration was born from the ashes of the heresy, a response to the horrifying realization that even the most trusted and beloved servant of the Emperor could be turned against him. The Inquisition's paranoia, its obsessive suspicion, its willingness to destroy entire worlds rather than risk the spread of corruption, all of this traces back to the lessons learned from Horus's betrayal. The ecclesiarchy exists Because of Horus, the state religion of the Imperium, which worships the emperor as a divine being despite his explicit rejection of divinity, grew in the vacuum left by the heresy. With the emperor entombed and silent, with no Primarch to guide the Imperium's spiritual life, humanity did what humans have always done when faced with loss and fear and uncertainty. They created a religion. They built cathedrals. They wrote scripture. They turned the emperor into exactly the kind of god he never wanted to be. And they used that religion to maintain social order in an Imperium that was falling apart at the seams. Horus would have laughed at this, or wept, or both. The man who rebelled because he believed the emperor was secretly planning to become a god ended up creating the circumstances that turned the emperor into one. The supreme irony of the Horus heresy is that the future Horus was trying to prevent is the future his own rebellion created. He was the architect of the very nightmare he was trying to escape. And now, 10,000 years later, the Great Rift has split the galaxy in half. Abaddon's 13th Black Crusade has torn open the barrier between real space and the warp. Chaos pours through the breach in unprecedented volumes, and the Imperium faces threats on every front that make the Horus heresy look like a minor border skirmish by comparison. The Tyranids consume world after world. The Necrons rise from their tomb worlds. The Orcs rampage across the galaxy in numbers that boggle the mind. And through it all, the Black Legion fights on, carrying the banner of a dead war master into battles that their Primarch never could have imagined. This is the world that Horus made. Not the world he wanted to make. Not the world he envisioned when he first accepted the whispers of the Chaos Gods on Davin. But the world his choices created nonetheless. A universe of endless war, of crushing oppression, of hope extinguished and faith corrupted and love turned to ash. And yet, even in this darkness, there is something that endures. The memory of what Horus was before he fell. The echo of the man who could make anyone feel important. The ghost of the leader who fought beside his father across the stars and earned the love of brothers who should have been rivals. That memory persists, not as a comfort, but as a challenge. A reminder that the darkness is not inevitable. That the Golden Age was real once, even if it was brief. That the dream the Emperor and Horus shared during those 30 years of unity was not an illusion, but a possibility that was stolen from humanity by forces that profit from despair. Horus Lupercal, the War Master, the favored son, the arch-traitor, the most important Primarch in the history of Warhammer 40,000. His name is a wound that will never heal. And in the continued telling of his story, in the refusal to let his fall be forgotten or reduced to simple villainy, there is something that transcends the grim darkness of the setting. There is the acknowledgement that great falls require great heights, and that the height from which Horus fell was the highest any human or superhuman has ever reached. He was the best of them. And that is exactly why his betrayal was the worst thing that ever happened to the galaxy. If you enjoyed spending this time exploring the story of the most important Primarch in Warhammer 40,000, I would be honored if you could show your support by hitting the like button and subscribing to the channel. Your support means everything, and it allows me to keep creating these deep explorations into the lore that we all love so much. Drop a comment below and let me know what you think. Was Horus truly the most important Primarch, or do you think another brother deserves that title? I would love to hear your thoughts. Until the next time, take care of yourselves. And remember, in the vastness of the void, between the light of dying stars and the silence of empty space, there are stories waiting to be told. Stories of heroes and villains, of fathers and sons, of choices made and consequences endured across the endless span of time. This has been Q on 40,000, and I will see you in the next one. A final reflection. The man behind the myth. There is one more thing I want to leave you with before we part ways. It is easy, after spending hours immersed in the lore of the Horus heresy, to think of Horus Lupercal as a character. a fictional construct designed to serve a narrative purpose within a tabletop wargaming universe. And of course, on one level, that is exactly what he is. But the reason Horus endures, the reason his story continues to fascinate and disturb and move people decades after it was first told, is that he is more than just a character. He is an archetype. He is the favored son who falls from grace. He is Lucifer in power armor. He is every talented, charismatic, deeply flawed leader who has ever been consumed by the very qualities that made them great. Yes, the story of Horus Lupercal will continue to be told as long as the Warhammer 40,000 universe endures. New novels will explore different facets of his personality. New game supplements will recreate his battles on tabletops around the world. New fans will discover his story and feel the same mixture of admiration and horror that veterans of the setting have felt for years. And every time that story is told, the same question will hang in the air, unspoken, but undeniable. Could it have been different? Could the Warmaster have been saved? Could the Golden Age have survived if just one thing, one conversation, one act of trust or honesty, or simple human decency, had gone differently? We will never know. That is the nature of tragedy. The road not taken remains forever invisible, and all we can see is the road that was. And on that road is stretching from the tunnels of Chthoniya to the throne room of the vengeful spirit. The footprints of a fallen sun lead humanity into 10,000 years of darkness. But even darkness has its ending. And in the distant, flickering possibility that the Emperor may one day rise from his throne, that the Primarchs may one day return, that the Imperium may one day remember what it was supposed to be, the story of Horus Lupercal will serve its final purpose, not as a celebration of villainy, not as a glorification of betrayal, but as a warning, carved in fire and blood across the face of a galaxy, that the price of silence between those who love each other is higher than any of us can afford to pay.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any. And yeah, sleep well.